everyone. Welcome. This is the direct file workshop and also on solitary confinement we'll be discussing today. My name is Paolo Annino. I am a teacher at FSU College of Law. I've been there since 1995. And I direct a children in prison project. And we'll be talking about direct files. And I'm really honored today with our panelists. We're hoping to have a real good discussion today. And so I'm trying to leave at least 20 minutes at the end of the panel so that we can have an open Q&A with the audience. The way we're going to proceed then is I'll introduce the panel to you. And then for those folks in the audience who don't have much of a background about direct file, and transfers, I want to give a quick overview, no more than 10 minutes maximum, on how this process works. And then I have questions for the different members of the panel. And then I'll ask the member a question, and then we'll have some discussion within the panel about these issues. So I'm looking forward to doing this today. So let me just begin with the panelists right here. Mr. Martinez, Carlos Martinez. Carlos, for those who, real quickly, is the public defender from Miami-Dade. Carlos has been an advocate for all his life for kids. I'm going to keep it short. The main thing when I think of Carlos is, besides being the public defender, he's the person that unshackled our children in the state of Florida. For years, Carlos was a leader in kids in Florida who were going to detention, from detention to court, were handcuffed, shackled, and they had a chain from the shackles to the handcuff. And Carlos was one of the leaders who fought many years. It was a group who did this too. But I wanted to bring that. That's one of Carlos' major accomplishments. So thank you, Carlos, for doing that. We're happy you're here today. Next on this side is Lily McCarty. Lily is one of my former students was it a number of years ago, 2003, wasn't it?
2002 or 2003.
Yeah, 2003. She was an excellent student. And Lily has been an advocate for kids for many years, a direct file representing kids on Graham cases, Miller cases, resentencings for children. One of her major accomplishments is working with the state attorney's offices and actually reducing the number of direct files, kids being transferred from the juvenile system to the adult criminal system. And she won the Davis Award for her work in actually reducing direct files for Hillsborough County. One last thing on Lily real quickly is I'm really proud of her on her big sisters. She's been a big sister for years, and the child that she worked with just graduated from high school. And if anyone knows, graduation from high school is a game changer, right? That really changes people's lives in the system. So that's great work. Next, if I may, is the state attorney from my area, the Second Judicial Circuit, Jack Campbell. Jack is I'm biased because I'm from Leon County, right? And so I actually see the work he does and his office and his organization. He just do excellent work in Leon County and in the 5 counties surrounding it. Jack is a graduate of FSU. Go FSU for those who like FSU. Jack's been an advocate for kids in a variety of ways. Boys Club. He's also been an advocate for victims of domestic violence. He's been involved in the refuge house in Tallahassee. Also on children, for the Northern District, Federal Northern District, he was appointed an assistant to work on children's cases dealing with cyber attacks on children. So we're really happy to have Mr. Campbell here today. Next is Scott McCoy. Scott is the Senior Policy Director of Southern Poverty Law Center. And for those who don't know what Southern Poverty Law Center is, Morris Dees was the leader for many years, and they simply kick butt. They're the ones who sued over and over again the Ku Klux Klan and realized that that was the way to fight the Ku Klux Klan. And they've done great work. But since those days of the Ku Klux Klan, and not that it's still going on, by the way, they've expanded. They've expanded to a variety of other issues. And one of the major issues Scott works on is juvenile justice. And so Scott, just real quickly, his background, anything you want to know about legislative stuff, Scott knows. He was a state senator from Utah, a real progressive state. Sorry. Anyway.
Makes Florida look liberal.
Yes. So anyway, from Utah, so he worked in Washington, D.C., in the House Agricultural Committee. He also worked for a congressman in Iowa. And he also did major campaigns too, very successful. So we have good backgrounds from a variety of areas. So the way I'm going to proceed today is I have some questions. I'm going to ask a panelist a question, and then we'll have for each question about 10 minutes discussion, and then we'll go to the next question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Okay? I think I'll just start off with Lily, if I may. So one of the major accomplishments Lily has done has been dealing with reducing kids being transferred from the juvenile system to the adult criminal system. And if I may I'll say a couple words about that first.
Sure.
You know, for those who don't realize, so just real quickly, how our transfer system works. One of my favorite authors is William Faulkner. And William Faulkner says, tomorrow began 10,000 years ago. Well, I only have a few minutes, so I can't go back 10,000 years. But I do need to go back to the 1950s in Florida. So from the 1950s to about 1988, 1989, during that time frame, the decision of whether or not to move a child from a juvenile program, from a juvenile system to the adult criminal system was made by judges in general. So judges made that decision. How did they make that decision? They made it through something called waiver hearings or fit hearings. The judges decided what would be appropriate for the child based on a bunch of standards. Would it be appropriate for the child to be in the juvenile system? Would it be appropriate for the child to be in the adult criminal system? Can the child be rehabilitated? All those issues were done by the judge. And that's how our system worked, not just in Florida, but around the country, from all the way up into the late 1980s. Then what happened, real quickly, what happened was starting in the late 1980s, beginning 1990s, we had a crime spike all around the country, not just Florida, but all around the country. But it hit Florida especially hard. And it was a crime spike just for adults and children. And the reason why it hit Florida especially hard, the crime spike, was we had major celebrity cases, or major cases that got international attention. We had in North Florida, we had, it's called the British tourist murders. The British tourist murders happened in North Florida, Madison, Florida. Then in South Florida, we had the German tourist murders. And in those cases, and this is really important, I think, for those who take a global perspective. Immediately, the British tourist murders, the German tourist murders, UK and Germany start telling their folks it's dangerous to come to Florida. Well, you can imagine what Florida tourism industry thought about that. And so immediately then, Florida then took the lead at that point in trying to figure out how to deal with the crime. Now, Florida we'll talk about what Florida did. One of the major things Florida did, now we're going to be talking about today, is they decided to take away what was traditionally the authority and power of the judges and moved it primarily to the state attorney. So now the state attorneys then have the discretion on which children get moved from the juvenile system to the adult criminal system. In 1995, we transferred 5,000 children from the juvenile system to the adult criminal system. As of last year, every year the number has gone down. As of last year, we've primarily we transferred approximately 1,400 children from the juvenile system to the adult criminal system. Just tell you a few things about these 1,400 children. I think one of the first things I want to mention is race. What we know is that 66% of the children transferred are African American children. What's really disturbing for someone that does my type of work, empirical work, is every year I look at the transfers and I try to see patterns. And there is a clear pattern that's happened in the last 6 years, that every year we're increasing the percentage of African American children who are being transferred. So even though the actual numbers of children are decreasing, the percentage of African American children are increasing. Just for those little background, Florida has approximately 20% of Florida children are African American. So we're talking 66% are being transferred. That's clearly a significant overrepresentation of African American children. So that's one thing we know about this population that's being transferred. Another thing we know about the population is the primary crime for felonies is burglary. So that's the primary crime for transfers is burglary. For misdemeanors, it changes year to year for misdemeanors. Felonies for burglary has been constant, but for misdemeanors, this past year has been vandalism. But sometimes it's drug misdemeanors. There's very few misdemeanors though that actually get transferred. The vast majority are felonies. One more thing on this topic is the issue of what happens to these children once they get moved from the juvenile system to the adult system. What we learned is the majority, 64 to 70% of the children, receive probation in the adult criminal system. So even though they're moved into the adult criminal system, majority of children do receive probation. Some children, roughly 200 or so, will go into the prison system. Roughly 300 or so will go into jails. So jails have more children than the adult prison system. What happens to these kids when they go into the prisons? We'll talk about one of the consequences. One of the consequences is solitary confinement. We know approximately 20% of all the children, when I say children, under 18, when I say children, I'm always talking about under 18, approximately 20% of children under 18 end up in solitary confinement in prison. They're treated just like adults. That means 3 times a week, they're allowed to leave the confinement for showers. After 30 days, they can have 3 hours of exercise. They're treated just like adults, which means also there is no limit on the duration, how long they can be in solitary confinement. So that's one of the major consequences of this transfer direct file process. Just one last comment, then we'll go to the questions, is one of my center's clients, Kasia Spencer from Volusia County. Kasia was 13 years old, walking to school. She sees someone drop the checkbook on the sidewalk. She makes a bad choice. She picks up the checkbook, brings it to school cafeteria. She writes a check for a slice of pizza. For at least for some folks in here, that's uttering, right? Because it's not her checkbook, it's uttering, a 3rd-degree felony. And then she writes a check still at the cafeteria. Oh, this always happens to me, I'm sorry about this. One time in court, the judge intentionally, I really like to judge too, but he intentionally called the marshal and took my phone away from me. It was so embarrassing. My students were all there too. So I was really giving a good example to my students, right? Yes.
It was a teaching moment.
Yeah, it was a teaching moment, yes. Absolutely. Back to caution. So she writes 2 checks, one for a pizza, one for a yearbook in the cafeteria. resource officer gets notified, she gets arrested. Through a number of violations of community service, she ends up being transferred in an adult criminal system. And within 6 months, she commits suicide. And what Department of Justice has told us, that 50% of all suicides are a result of solitary confinement. So this is one of the strong issues, one of the leading issues here in Florida, and we're going to start off with Lily. Lily, why don't you explain to us how you were able to, with your work, reduce reduce direct files?
So I just want to say I think everyone here is exceptional, and I feel so privileged to sit up here and speak to so many of you that I know have done such amazing work with juveniles. I worked for Julie Holt for 8 years as an assistant public defender, and Julie had to tackle the alarming number of direct files that we had in Hillsborough County. It was astronomical. And we were comparing to Miami and Jacksonville, which I'm pretty loud. Okay. We had to address the issues. So we were looking at Jacksonville and we were looking at Miami, and their numbers were significantly lower than Hillsborough County. So we knew that we had to tackle the problem in Hillsborough County. And I would go down to Miami and evaluate why Miami's numbers were so much lower. And I would shadow Tamara Gray, who's an exceptional, is she here today? She's exceptional. And Rob Mason helped me a lot as well with Jacksonville. And we realized that in Hillsborough County, there were a multitude of issues, but one of them was the particular area that the children were being arrested in. We were targeting what zip codes were having the higher numbers. We were looking at what law enforcement agencies were having more cases direct filed. We also were looking at what we were doing as defense counsel to advocate properly for these children. Well, as we realized these issues, we compared ourselves again to Miami. And what we found out in Miami was that when they were determining who was making the direct file decisions, there was only one or a handful of state attorneys that were involved in making that decision. In Hillsborough County, there are so many different divisions. And if a juvenile had a co-defendant who was an adult, the juvenile automatically went to adult court for intake at that time. And so you had so many intake attorneys, and you knew which ones were automatically going to direct file a juvenile, you knew which ones were going to listen to mitigation, and you knew which ones were more likely to keep the juvenile in adult court. So there's so many different personalities and so many different people involved. So we started targeting the ones that we knew were going to be on board with listening to mitigation and getting in early on. The second that child was in detention, I was called over to the detention to say, this is probably going to be a direct file. It's a 16 or a 17-year-old. They have a burglary charge. We knew what cases were being highly direct filed in Hillsborough County. So we would get the parents to sometimes sign releases right there at the detention hearing. We'd get to the schools immediately. We would get to the mental health record immediately. We would meet with the parents immediately. We would create, similar to a sentencing memorandum, and present it to the state attorney's office early on and ask them to consider not filing the juvenile in adult court. We were often successful, or sometimes they would come back and say, we won't file in direct court, however, we want the child to agree to go into a commitment program. And that drove Julie crazy. She didn't like that at all, but that would sometimes happen as well. So we were looking at that, but we realized that we needed to expand beyond the state attorney's office. We needed to educate the attorneys within the public defender's office as well. And we would have consistent trainings, which the public defender's office still does, on the effects of direct files, how to avoid having a child direct filed, and then the younger attorneys were being trained on that as well. We also realized that we needed to educate the police, and we needed to educate the community. So what we did was we created a slideshow. It was a PowerPoint presentation that discussed 985-557. Kids didn't realize, their parents didn't realize, the community didn't realize that they were being able to be direct filed at 14 years old. So, and at 16 for any felony. So this information was put into a PowerPoint, and so we were primarily going into the detention centers where kids were getting arrested. We would go every few weeks and meet with them regularly at Detention Center East and Detention Center West. And as well, we went into every church that would let us in. We would go into every community organization that would let us in. We were there nights, we were there weekends. And what we would do is we would give this presentation, and we gave every child or every parent there a score sheet, an adult score sheet. And we had them tell us their criminal record as best as that they could. And we explained to them that if you're a juvenile, your record can still be used against you for 5 years from the date of offense. And so they would create a score sheet. And then if they hadn't been arrested, we said, give us something that your friend's been arrested for. And we would show them you're scoring prison on your first arrest if you're direct filed. So it became a reality more and more to the community, to the kids, and then the community started rallying around. And then the resource officers asked us to come in and speak with them. And then police officers asked us to come and speak with them. So we really targeted not only our work as defense counsel. We wrote so many letters to the state attorney's office asking them to meet with us and talk with us about it and giving them, I think one of the state attorneys, he's retired now, he said, Lily, if you send me another article on juvenile brain development, I'm going to lose my mind. So we just talked to them over and over and over again, and it was just not taking no for an answer. It was not going away, and it was realizing that we had to address the problem areas. I think I've answered all of the questions, but that's what we did. And Professor Annino, my work with you really was exceptional, and my work with Julie was exceptional, and I only was able to do that work because of some amazing mentors in my life. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Anyone in the panel would like to add to these comments?
I mean, I would just say that's incredible work, and it sounds like it took an inordinate amount of time, and it's great. I'm glad that you did it, but I think that we have a structural problem with direct file, in my opinion, and that structural problem, that balance of power problem, I think is obviously susceptible to being bent a little bit by your efforts, which are fantastic, and I wish happened more and more around the state. But I think to actually set the system back in balance, we need to change the way the law is written and structured, and change how we go about transferring and what that process is. So I would just encourage us, I mean, in my opinion, I think that we do need a structural change. That also helps. A structural change helps because, state attorneys come and go. And because of that, you may have at one time a more progressive state attorney that is, doing the right thing in terms of process and making the direct file decision, but then another place you don't, and you have wide geographic disparities and justice by geography. And if we want lasting, meaningful change to put that balance back in place, I think we need a legislative fix.
Well, the scariest part about the direct file process is that there is no discretionary review whatsoever. And so there's no ability, if you think I had a child that was direct filed once at 16 years old for taking crabs out of a crab trap in the Tampa Bay. And that's still one that bothers me more than anything because it was so senseless and so unneeded. But there was no ability for the judge to do anything unless the child pled open to the court and then asked for juvenile sanctions. We were able to get it dismissed on a motion to dismiss because it was in the Bay. They couldn't tell if it was Pinellas County or Hillsborough County. But it was so frustrating because the only way that I can get this child juvenile sanctions is to plead guilty. I mean, that was so frustrating to me. And that is what's the scariest part about direct files, is that it is solely at the hands of the state attorney with no ability. It's completely unfettered discretion.
Let me just ask the next question, and I'll just move on to the next one. So I'm going to ask to Mr. Martinez, since we're talking about structural issues here. So just last week, California. Okay.
That one?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll use this one here. Just last week, California passed a law, it was signed by the governor, that prohibited transferring of 14 and 15-year-olds to the adult criminal system. So all 14 and 15-year-olds in California are no longer can be transferred from the juvenile system to adult criminal system. Mr. Martinez, what's your impression of that law, and what do you think? We're the third largest state in the union, 20.2 million people. California is the largest. Should we be following California?
We should be doing a hell of a lot more than California. That's a great start, but you know what? I'm sick of waiting. We have been trying to get reform done under the direct file system in Florida for 20 years. I can tell you every single legislator who filed a bill, who tried to do something. And thankfully, recently, at least, we had a hearing in one of them, and we were all thankful that there was even a workshop. But so the reality is that unfortunately, and I don't know, I haven't talked to anybody about this, but I was recently thinking about,